In 1887, on a homestead outside Abilene, Kansas, a boy named Elias turned 14 years old in March. By that birthday, he'd already butchered his first hog, set and run a trap line through 2 winters, split enough wood to heat a house for 6 months, and built the smokehouse where that meat was cured. His father didn't throw him a party. His father handed him an axe and told him the north fence needed replacing before the ground froze. Nobody called what Elias knew survival skills. They called it Tuesday. Number 17 on this list is the one skill that almost no adult American can perform today, even though it kept every frontier family from starving through January. And number 6 will change the way you think about what a 14-year-old is actually capable of. This is what your great-grandfather knew before he was old enough to vote. Before we start, subscribe to this channel because the skills on this list didn't disappear by accident, and once you hear what an average frontier kid could do by age 14, you're going to want to know what else got quietly left behind. Let's count them down. Number 20. Splitting and stacking a full cord of firewood without instruction. On a working homestead in the late 1800s, a boy was expected to split and stack a cord of firewood. That's 128 cubic feet of cut, split, and stacked wood by the time he was strong enough to swing an axe properly. Most boys started splitting by age 10 and were doing full cords alone by 12 or 13. The skill wasn't just about strength, it was about reading the grain of the wood, knowing which knots would split cleanly and which would fight back, and understanding that green wood and dry wood behave completely differently. A full winter supply for a modest farmhouse required between 5 and 8 cords, depending on the size of the stove and the severity of the season. A boy who split wood poorly wasted wood. A family that ran out of wood in February in Nebraska faced a genuine survival problem. Today, the average 14-year-old has never split a piece of firewood. Number 19, sharpening every edge tool on the farm to a working edge. A dull axe doesn't just cut poorly. It bounces, skips, and causes accidents. Every boy on a frontier homestead learned to keep the cutting edges of axes, draw knives, hatchets, scythes, and pocket knives sharp using whetstones, files, and leather strops. The skill required understanding bevel angles, which varied by tool and by what the tool was used for. A felling axe needed a different edge than a splitting maul. A draw knife used for peeling logs needed a different grind than one used for shaping wheel spokes. A lot of frontier families kept a small whetstone hanging near the door so tools could be touched up every time they were used. By the 1890s, traveling tool sharpeners still made rounds through rural areas, but a boy who depended on someone else to keep his tools sharp was considered a liability. Number 18. Reading the sky accurately enough to make farming decisions. Before weather forecasting, before radar, before the National Weather Service, every farming family depended on direct observation to make decisions that could cost them their crop or their lives. Boys learned to read cloud formations, wind shifts, changes in animal behavior, and the color of the sky at specific times of day. A mackerel sky, those rippled high clouds that look like fish scales, meant rain within 24 hours. A red sky in the morning was taken seriously, not as a rhyme but as a genuine warning. Boys watched which way cows were lying in a field, how low barn swallows were flying, and whether smoke from the chimney was rising straight or curling back down. By age 14, a boy on a working farm had logged several years of direct observation and could call weather changes with reasonable accuracy. The USDA didn't establish a formal weather forecasting service until 1870, and rural families didn't trust it anyway. They trusted what they'd learned to see with their own eyes. Number 17, starting a fire with flint and steel every time, not sometimes. Matches existed on the frontier, but they were expensive, they got wet, and they ran out. Every boy learned to start fire using a steel striker, a piece of flint or chert, and a char cloth or tinder fungus that caught the spark and held it long enough to transfer to a tinder nest. The process sounds simple, but it's not. The steel has to strike the flint at the right angle to throw a proper spark. The char cloth has to be made correctly, which itself is a separate skill. The tinder nest has to be dry, loosely packed in the right shape, and held the right way when you blow it to flame. In wet weather, the whole system gets harder. Boys practiced until they could reliably produce fire in under 2 minutes under normal conditions. The skill was that common and that expected. Number 16, butchering a full hog cleanly without wasting a usable part. Fall butchering day was one of the most important days on the frontier calendar. When temperatures dropped enough to keep the meat from spoiling, usually between late October and early December, every farm family with pigs went through the same process. The hog was killed, bled, scalded in boiling water to loosen the bristles, scraped clean, and then broken down into hams, shoulders, ribs, belly, fat back, and trim. Nothing was wasted. The head went into head cheese, the fat was rendered into lard, the intestines were cleaned for use as sausage casings, the feet were pickled. A boy old enough to be useful was expected to help with every stage, and to be able to run it himself by his mid-teens. A 400-pound hog, properly handled, could provide a significant share of a family's protein for the winter. Most American adults today have never seen a butchering and couldn't describe the process. Number 15, setting, checking, and running a trap line through the winter months. Trapping wasn't a hobby on the frontier, it was a cash crop. Beaver, muskrat, mink, fox, and raccoon pelts could be sold to traders or used for clothing and blankets. A boy who ran a trap line learned to identify animal runs and travel corridors, to set steel traps in ways that hid human scent, to dispatch trapped animals quickly, and to skin and stretch pelts in the specific way each species required. A well-run trap line of 20 to 30 traps could produce real income for a family over a single winter. Boys typically started with smaller traps for muskrat and rabbit and worked up to the larger steel traps used for beaver and otter. A lot of frontier boys ran their lines alone before dawn, reset traps, and made it back in time for morning chores. The fur trade that helped open the American West wasn't run by mountain men alone. It was sustained in large part by farm boys who treated it like a second job. Here's what the textbooks skip over. Every skill on this list so far wasn't taught in a classroom, wasn't covered in a curriculum, and wasn't learned from a book. It was learned by doing, starting young, making mistakes that had real consequences, and being expected to get it right the next time. The frontier didn't have a minimum age for responsibility. It had a minimum level of competence, and that level was set by survival, not by policy. A 10-year-old who couldn't split wood wasn't sheltered from the task. He was handed an axe and shown once. By the time he was 14, he'd been doing it for 4 years. What's easy to miss in that picture is what it did to a kid's relationship with difficulty. When you've been solving real problems since you were old enough to carry a bucket, the idea that a task might be too hard for you doesn't really take hold. That's not nostalgia. That's a measurable difference in how people approach problems. Number 14, identifying wild plants well enough to eat them safely and to avoid the ones that'd kill you. The frontier was full of edible wild plants, but it was also full of poisonous ones that looked similar. Boys learned to identify several dozen plant species by sight, season, and habitat. They learned which parts were edible and which weren't, which plants were safe raw, and which needed cooking, and which lookalikes were dangerous enough to memorize cold. Wild onions were a reliable spring food, but had to be distinguished from death commas, which can kill a child quickly. Wild berries had to be identified correctly before a younger sibling ate the wrong ones. A lot of families kept a working knowledge of local plants that stretched across medicinal and nutritional uses. This wasn't casual knowledge. A boy who made a misidentification in the field could poison himself or his family. Communities with stronger traditional plant knowledge consistently had lower mortality rates during the first years of settlement, when crops were uncertain and stores were thin. Number 13. Finding water in unfamiliar terrain and knowing whether it was safe to drink. On the frontier, water wasn't guaranteed. Wells went dry, springs ran seasonal, and rivers carried disease when they were contaminated upstream. Boys learned to read the landscape for water signs. Cottonwood trees running in a line usually meant a water table close to the surface. Animal trails converging in one direction often led to a water source. Green vegetation in a dry landscape pointed to moisture underneath. They also learned to assess water quality by sight and smell, to know that clear water running over rocks was safer than still water in a hollow, and to use boiling as a treatment when they weren't sure. A boy who could find and evaluate water in unfamiliar country was a boy who could survive being lost, which wasn't a hypothetical on the frontier. Number 12. Basic horse care, including hoof inspection and the early signs of colic. A horse was the most valuable piece of equipment most frontier families owned. Losing a horse to a preventable injury or illness during planting or harvest could mean the difference between a successful season and a failed one. Boys learned to pick and inspect hooves for stones, cracks, and thrush, a common bacterial infection that could lame a horse quickly if untreated. They learned to recognize the early signs of colic, a catch-all term for digestive distress in horses that could range from mild discomfort to a fatal condition. They learned basic harness fitting and repair because an ill-fitting collar could produce shoulder sores that put a horse out of work for weeks. A lot of boys were also trained in basic farrier skills, at least enough to reset a thrown shoe in the field when a farrier wasn't available. In 1880, there were roughly 10.4 million horses in the United States, one for every 5 people. Most Americans today have never touched a horse's hoof. Number 11. Building a split-rail fence that'd actually hold livestock for years. Frontier fence building wasn't decorative. It was functional containment for animals that, if they escaped, represented a family's entire food supply and economic base. Boys learned to split straight-grained logs into rails using a froe and a mallet, and to set posts correctly so they wouldn't heave out of the ground during a freeze-thaw cycle. A well-built split-rail fence required no nails and no hardware. The rails locked together in a zigzag pattern called a worm fence or snake fence, which spread weight and movement across the whole structure instead of concentrating stress at any single point. A mile of fence required hundreds of rails and several days of work. Boys on larger homesteads sometimes built entire fence sections alone over a summer. The skill involved geometry, material knowledge, and enough physical endurance to swing a mallet and drag logs across rough ground for hours. Number 10. Preserving meat through smoking and salting so a family could eat through February. Before refrigeration, winter food security depended entirely on how well a family had preserved their fall harvest of meat. Boys learned 2 main methods. Salt curing involved packing meat in dry salt or submerging it in a brine solution for a specific number of days, depending on the thickness of the cut, then hanging it to dry in a cool, ventilated space. Smoking involved hanging cured or green meat in a smokehouse over a low, smoldering fire of specific hardwoods, usually hickory or applewood, for anywhere from several hours to several days, depending on what was being preserved. The ratio of salt to meat mattered. The temperature of the smoke mattered. The moisture content of the meat going in mattered. A family that got the process wrong could find itself with spoiled meat in December instead of a winter supply. Most American households today don't own a single tool for food preservation beyond a refrigerator. Number 9. Following a blazed trail and leaving markings that someone else could follow. Before GPS, before marked highways, before reliable maps of the western interior, people navigated by blazes, landmarks, and memorized terrain features. Trail blazes were notches or marks cut into trees at eye height, usually in a pattern that signaled direction and distance. Boys learned to read these markings and to leave their own in ways that'd still be legible weeks later. They also learned to navigate by the sun's position, by the direction of moss growth on north-facing tree trunks, and by the behavior of streams. In winter, with snow covering ground-level landmarks, this knowledge became critical. A boy who got turned around in unfamiliar timber and couldn't navigate out was a boy who might not come back. The United States Forest Service, established in 1905, documented hundreds of traditional trail marking systems used by indigenous communities, settlers, and military scouts. Pause for a second on what this list is actually telling you. Every skill here was routine, not exceptional, not the domain of specialists or survivalists or people who'd chosen a certain lifestyle. These were the baseline competencies expected of an ordinary 14-year-old farm boy in the United States. Not a soldier, not a frontiersman by profession. A kid who went to a one-room schoolhouse a few months a year and spent the rest of his time doing these things because they had to get done. That baseline is gone, not gradually eroded, gone. The average 14-year-old in 2026 can't start a fire, can't read a weather system, can't preserve food, can't navigate without a phone signal, and has never processed an animal from hole to table. That's not a criticism of kids, it's a description of what we stopped teaching and why. The skills on this list didn't disappear because they became unnecessary. They disappeared because industrial systems made it possible to outsource them, and then we forgot to notice when the outsourcing became total dependency. The difference between your great-grandfather at 14 and a 14-year-old today isn't intelligence. It's what they were expected to practice every single day. If you're getting value from this list, now's a good time to hit subscribe. This channel covers lost American knowledge, forgotten skills, and buried history across 6 different series, and there's a lot more coming. Now let's keep going. Number 8, making usable rope from plant fibers found on or near the homestead. Before synthetic cordage, rope was made from whatever fibrous plant material was available locally. Hemp, flax, cattail leaves, and dogbane were the most common sources on the American frontier. Boys learned to ret the plant material, which meant soaking it until the outer stalk broke down and the fibers could be separated. Then to comb the fibers straight, twist them into yarn, and lay multiple yarns together into a finished rope. The technique sounds simple, but the twist direction matters. The fibers in each yarn twist one way, and the yarns twist the opposite direction when laid into a rope. That counter twist is what locks the structure together under tension. A rope made with the wrong twist direction will unwind under load instead of tightening. Frontier boys making rope for well buckets, plow harnesses, and fence repairs needed to get this right or face a broken harness mid-furrow. Number 7, treating cuts, burns, and infected wounds without a doctor. Frontier families could be days from the nearest physician, and a lot of injuries that'd send a modern American to urgent care had to be handled at home. Boys learned to clean wounds with boiled water or whiskey, to pack deep cuts with clean cloth or yarrow leaves to slow bleeding, and to recognize the signs of infection before it went systemic. They learned to treat burns with cool water and a lard or plantain poultice, to splint fractures with straight wood and strips of cloth, and to watch for the red streaking that meant a wound infection was spreading toward the bloodstream. Most frontier families kept a small set of medical supplies, including bandages, laudanum, and carbolic acid. Boys who grew up on these homesteads weren't squeamish about injury. They'd seen too much of it and been too responsible for dealing with it to have that luxury. Number 6, threshing grain and grinding it into usable flour. For families that grew their own wheat or corn, the harvest wasn't done when the crop came in from the field. The grain had to be separated from the stalks and husks, which was done by beating the harvested crop against a flat surface or walking animals over it, then tossing it into the wind so the lighter chaff blew away and the heavier grain fell back down, a process called winnowing. Once cleaned, the grain had to be ground into flour or meal before it could be cooked. A lot of homesteads used hand-operated stone mills for small amounts of grain. Others took their grain to a commercial grist mill, sometimes a half-day's ride away. Boys running this process alone ground their own flour and managed the mill schedule as part of regular weekly work. An adult who'd grown up on a frontier homestead could look at a bag of whole wheat and know every step between that and a loaf of bread. Today, most Americans have never seen grain before it was processed. Number 5. Making tallow candles and lye soap from rendered fat and wood ash. These two skills shared a starting material. When a hog or beef animal was butchered in the fall, the fat was rendered down in a large iron kettle, producing tallow that served as the raw material for both candles and soap. For candles, the tallow was poured into molds around pre-dipped wicks or applied in repeated layers to hanging wicks. For soap, the tallow was combined with lye water, which was made by running water through hardwood ash until it was strong enough to float a raw egg. The mixture was cooked together until it thickened and could be poured into molds. Both processes required managing a fire under a large kettle for several hours, knowing when the material had reached the right consistency, and timing the pour correctly. A family that didn't make enough candles before winter spent their evenings in the dark. Boys handled both tasks as part of fall production work, starting in their early teens. Number 4. Tanning a hide from raw skin to finished leather. A freshly removed animal hide will rot in days if it isn't processed. Turning it into durable leather is a multi-step process that takes weeks and requires several different treatments. The frontier method started with fleshing the hide, scraping all remaining fat and tissue from the skin side. Then the hide was soaked in a solution of water and wood ash to loosen the hair, which was then scraped away. The hide was then treated with tan bark, a solution made from oak bark that's high in tannins, which is what converts the raw skin protein into stable leather. The whole process, from raw hide to finished leather, took 4 to 8 weeks of daily attention. Boys doing this work were producing the material used for harnesses, shoe soles, belts, and saddle components. A farming family that couldn't tan hides had to buy leather, and in cash, poor frontier economies, that meant going without. The word tanner became a common surname in America because the skill was widespread enough to define entire families. Here's what should sit with you. You've just heard 17 skills that a 14-year-old boy was expected to know, practice, and perform reliably without supervision in the 1880s. Not 17 things he'd heard about, not 17 things a parent had demonstrated once. 17 things he did regularly, got good at, and was held accountable for, and none of it was considered remarkable. It was the baseline, the floor, the minimum expected of a kid his age on a working homestead. The last 3 items on this list are the ones that matter most because they're not just skills. They represent something that went away when the skills went away. Something about the relationship between a person and the problem in front of them. The culture that produced your great-grandfather wasn't tougher by accident. It was tougher because it asked more of its children earlier and didn't apologize for it. Whether we want to reclaim any of that is worth thinking about. Number 3. Building a basic weather-tight shelter from whatever materials were on site. This wasn't wilderness survival in the modern sense. It was a routine construction skill applied to a common problem. Boys learned to evaluate available materials, which on the plains often meant sod since timber was scarce, and in wooded regions meant fallen or standing timber that could be worked with a draw knife and an axe. A sod dugout could be built by 2 people in a few days. A basic log lean-to could be up in an afternoon. A proper one-room cabin with a fireplace and a tight roof took a crew and several weeks. But a boy who understood the principles could contribute usefully from his mid-teens. The key knowledge was about roofing, drainage, and the relationship between the shelter and the prevailing wind. A cabin that caught the wind wrong was a cold cabin, no matter how well the walls were built. A roof that didn't shed water correctly rotted the structure from the top down. Boys on the frontier watched these problems happen, watched their fathers fix them, and absorbed the cause and effect relationship between construction decisions and consequences. A lot of them built their first outbuilding alone by age 15 or 16. Number 2. Navigating accurately by the sun and stars without any instrument. Before GPS, before pocket compasses became widely available, before reliable maps of the interior existed, people navigated by direct celestial observation. Boys learned to track the sun's arc across the sky and use it as a direction-finding tool, understanding that the sun rose in the east and set in the west, but that its noon position shifted significantly with the seasons. They learned to find north at night using Polaris, the North Star, and to navigate from it without a compass. They also learned the star patterns that indicated east-west and north-south lines and how to use them to walk a straight course through timber or across open prairie at night. This skill was life or death in open country. A man who got turned around on the Great Plains in the 1870s and couldn't navigate back to a landmark could die before finding shelter. Frontier letters and diaries from that period describe navigation as a skill. Fathers were careful to pass on early because a son who couldn't find his way home from a day's ride was a son who might not come home. We gave up this skill so gradually that most Americans don't know they've lost it. Number 1, the understanding that the skills themselves weren't the point. Every boy who grew up on a frontier homestead and learned to do these 19 things learned something else in the process that never made it onto a list and can't be taught directly. He learned that he was capable, not in the general way adults tell children they're capable, but in the specific, demonstrated, tested way that comes from having solved 100 real problems before the age of 15. He knew he could feed himself. He knew he could stay warm. He knew he could navigate out of a bad situation. He knew that when something broke, he could probably fix it, and if he couldn't, he could figure out what he needed to learn. That knowledge, the kind that comes from actual competence rather than encouragement, is what the frontier system produced in its young people almost as a byproduct. The skills were the vehicle. The outcome was a person who didn't need to be told that difficulty was survivable because he'd already survived a lot of it. Most of the skills on this list can still be learned. Most of them are still out there in books, in living practitioners, in channels like this one, in community workshops and farming co-ops across the country. What's harder to rebuild is the expectation that you should know them, and the daily practice that turned knowing into second nature. Your great-grandfather didn't know these things because he was exceptional. He knew them because everyone around him did, and nobody had decided yet that it was okay to forget. This week, pick one skill from this list and find someone who can walk you through the hands-on version. Not a video, a person, a neighbor, a grandparent, someone at a local farm or craft guild who still does it. That gap between knowing something existed and actually being able to do it is the real cost of what got left behind. If this list changed the way you think about what your great-grandparents were capable of before they were old enough to vote, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There's still a generation alive who grew up knowing most of this. We're still in time to ask them.